When you stop talking to an avoidant, something very powerful happens, not outside of them, but inside. You have to understand that an avoidant spends most of their life creating distance as a way of staying safe. Silence for them is usually a tool of control. It allows them to regulate how much intimacy they can handle without feeling overwhelmed. But when that silence no longer comes from them, when it comes from you, it creates a disturbance in the very system they've built to feel secure. At first, they may act as if nothing's wrong. They've trained themselves to appear indifferent, even when they're not. They may convince themselves, and even try to convince you, if you were watching closely, that your absence doesn't matter. But here's the truth, it does. And the reason it matters is because your silence forces them to confront a conflict they've worked so hard to avoid. The conflict between their craving for independence and their hidden, very real fear of being abandoned. You see, avoidants don't walk through life immune to connection. They want closeness like everyone else. They want to be loved, desired, chosen. The difference is they're terrified of what that love will demand of them. In their mind, closeness equals suffocation, loss of freedom, pressure, the possibility of rejection. So what do? They pull away first. They maintain control by keeping the other person at arm's length. That way, if anyone is going to leave, it won't be them, it'll be you. But here's the paradox. When you actually stop talking, when you stop playing into that script, they feel abandoned anyway. And that's where the inner conflict ignites. On one hand, their independence tells them, good, this is what you wanted. Space, no pressure, freedom. But on the other hand, their heart whispers, wait, did I just lose something real? Did my silence actually cost me what I didn't want to admit I valued? This contradiction can be excruciating. It shakes their emotional foundation because it exposes something they've buried beneath all that detachment, the fear of loss. Now, what's fascinating here is that your silence doesn't just make them miss you. It makes them question themselves. It holds up a mirror they usually avoid looking into. They're forced to consider whether their pattern of distancing is really protecting them or if it's simply sabotaging them. And this is where growth begins, because no one grows when they're comfortable. We only grow when something interrupts our pattern, when the normal cycle breaks and we're left staring at the consequences of our own behavior. That's exactly what your silence does. It interrupts their cycle. It takes away the control they thought they had. For once, they're not the one deciding how close or far the relationship will go. You've disrupted the rhythm they counted on, and now they're left in uncertainty. And uncertainty is uncomfortable. It breeds anxiety. It makes them ask questions like, did I push too far? Did I misjudge how much they cared? Have I finally run out of chances? This is important for you to realize when you stop talking to an avoidant. You're not just walking away. You're giving them the one thing they resist most but need the most: space to feel. Avoidants often numb themselves with distance, but silence imposed by someone else strips them of that numbness. It exposes the raw vulnerability they've been avoiding. That's why sometimes, even though they'll never admit it, your silence has more impact on them than 1,000 words ever could. Of course, not every avoidant will suddenly change because you went silent. Some may retreat further into themselves, convincing their ego that they never cared to begin with. But even then, your silence is not wasted, because the point isn't to manipulate them into chasing you. The point is to protect your dignity, to reclaim your power, and to let their actions, or inactions, reveal the truth. And here's what's beautiful: if they truly value you, silence becomes the trigger that pulls them back towards you. If they don't, silence becomes the filter that clears them out of your life. Either way, you win. You either get clarity or you get commitment. So remember this: silence isn't weakness, and it's not avoidance of your own. It's a declaration of self-respect. When you stop talking to an avoidant, you're not abandoning them, you're allowing them to finally confront what they've been running from, and whether they rise to meet that or collapse under it. You've already done the bravest thing you can do. You've stepped out of the cycle and chosen yourself. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. When you stop talking to an avoidant, it doesn't just create silence in the relationship, it creates a gap. And human beings, no matter how much they pretend otherwise, are wired to notice gaps. We are drawn to what's missing. An avoidant is no different. The very space they once fought for now becomes the space they can't help but notice. And what do they do with that? They begin testing. Now, they won't usually test you in direct, obvious ways. Avoidants aren't known for coming forward with big declarations or vulnerable admissions. Instead, their methods are subtle, even quiet, almost invisible to anyone who isn't paying attention. They may check your social media profile late at night, scrolling through to see if your life has moved on without them. They may suddenly watch your stories, like a random post from weeks ago, or show up in the online spaces they know you frequent. Sometimes they'll even send you a message that looks casual on the surface. Something like, "Hey, how have you been?" Or a question about something trivial, like a show you once watched together. But make no mistake, this isn't casual. It's a test. What they're really doing is trying to measure the depth of your absence. They want to know, are you still open to them? Have you truly pulled away? Do they still have a place in your world, even after they pushed you away from theirs? And because they fear rejection, they won't always ask outright. They'd rather leave breadcrumbs, little signals, to see if you'll take the first step toward closing the gap. This is the paradox of the avoidant. They crave reassurance, but they're too afraid to ask for it directly. They want to know they still matter, but they don't want to expose themselves to the vulnerability of hearing no. So they hover at the edges, half present, half absent, hoping you'll reveal where you stand without them having to risk much of themselves. And here's where the deeper psychology comes in. Their testing behavior isn't random. It's rooted in the same inner conflict we talked about earlier. On one hand, they want the freedom that silence gives them. On the other, they fear the emptiness that silence creates. So they use these subtle checks as a way to hold on to both. They get to maintain the illusion of distance, but still secure the comfort of knowing you're not gone completely. But here's the critical point for you when you see those tests. You have to recognize them for what they are. They are not signs of full commitment. They are not proof of transformation. They are signals of fear, curiosity, and the first stirrings of recognition that your silence matters. And if you mistake those signals for something bigger than they are, you run the risk of breaking your own silence too soon, of stepping back into the cycle before the avoidant has actually done the deeper work of confronting themselves. Your job is not to respond to every breadcrumb, not to chase after every small test they throw your way. Your job is to hold steady in the silence you've chosen. Because the more they realize that you will not fill the gap for them, the more pressure they feel to step into it themselves. That's how change happens, not when you rescue them from their discomfort, but when you let them sit in it long enough that they decide to move. There's also a philosophical truth here worth pausing on. Silence is not just the absence of sound, it is a presence in itself. It has weight, it has power, and when directed with intention, it communicates more than words ever could. When you stop talking to an avoidant, your silence is not empty, it's a message. It says, I am no longer willing to play this game of half measures. If you want me, you must step forward with clarity. That message can't be spoken, it has to be lived. And so, when the avoidant begins testing, when they linger on your profile, when they drop a small message, when they circle back just to see if you'll bite. Your silence becomes the answer. Not a cold, punishing silence, but a dignified one. A silence that says, "My life doesn't revolve around your fear. I am here, I am whole, and I am no longer chasing." The irony is, this dignified silence is often the only thing that makes them truly pay attention. Because in testing you, what they often discover is not just whether you're still there, but whether you've changed. And when they sense that change, when they realize the old dynamic has shifted, that's when the game stops being fun for them. That's when they're forced to face the truth. If they don't step up, they lose you. So the next time you notice those little tests, those faint signals from the sidelines, remember they are proof that your silence is working. They are not invitations to break it, but confirmations that you've finally shifted the power dynamic. And here's the reflection I want to leave you with. Every time you resist the urge to respond to a test, you are teaching them something profound, that love cannot be measured in half efforts and connection cannot survive on crumbs. True connection only grows when both people are willing to show up fully. And until they do, your silence speaks louder than anything you could ever say. When you stop talking to an avoidant, something fascinating happens in the dynamic between you. It's not just about silence anymore. It's about the balance of power. Because in most relationships with an avoidant, the power has always tilted in their direction. They set the pace. They decide how close things get. They control how much access you have to them, and you, without even realizing it, fall into a pattern of adjusting, compensating, and carrying the weight of the connection. But silence flips the script. For the first time, you are no longer orbiting around their distance. You're no longer trying to decode their moods or strategize the right way to pull them closer. You're no longer running after breadcrumbs, hoping they'll eventually give you the fullness you deserve. Instead, your absence forces them to feel what it's like when they're not the one dictating the terms anymore. The balance shifts. And here's why this matters so much. Avoidants are often drawn to partners who do the emotional heavy lifting because it allows them to stay in control without ever having to risk vulnerability. They get the comfort of connection without the responsibility of showing up fully. But when you stop talking, when you withdraw the energy you've been pouring in, the scales suddenly even out. And that is uncomfortable for them. It forces them into a position they rarely experience, the position of needing. Now, understand this clearly. Power in relationships isn't about domination or manipulation. It's not about one person winning while the other loses. True power is about balance. It's about both people showing up with equal investment, equal willingness to risk, equal commitment to building something real. When you stop talking to an avoidant, what you're really doing is creating the conditions for balance to exist. You're saying, "I will no longer be the one doing all the work. If you want this, you will have to meet me halfway." And this is where the psychological depth lies. For the avoidant, that shift is jarring. It destabilizes the safety of the role they've always played, the one where they get to hold back and still be pursued. Now, they feel the consequences of their own distance. They feel what it's like to no longer have the upper hand. And for the first time, they face a choice: step up or step out. What often happens in this moment is reflection. Your silence becomes a catalyst for them to examine their own behavior, even if they don't admit it to you. They may start asking themselves questions they've never asked before. Why am I always the one pulling away? What am I so afraid of? If I keep living this pattern, will I end up alone? These are uncomfortable questions, but they are necessary. And without the balance of power shifting, they might never have asked them. But here's the empowering part for you. No matter how they respond, you've already reclaimed your power. You've stopped playing a losing game, and in doing so, you've changed the dynamic. If they step up, it's not because you begged, pleaded, or convinced them. It's because they chose to meet you at your level. If they don't, then their silence has simply revealed the truth. Either way, you are no longer stuck in a cycle of one-sided effort. This is the philosophical beauty of silence. It doesn't just communicate boundaries, it enforces them. It creates a natural filter. Those who are willing to meet you will move toward you. Those who aren't will drift away. And while that may sting in the short term, in the long term, it spares you the pain of carrying a relationship that was never truly balanced. And let's be clear, reclaiming power isn't about punishing the avoidant or making them chase you. It's about standing in your dignity. It's about remembering that your value isn't proven by how much you can endure someone else's distance. Your value is inherent, and the right person will recognize it without needing to be chased. So when the balance shifts, don't rush to reset it. Don't fill the silence out of fear or desperation. Allow the weight of that power shift to do its work. Allow the avoidant to feel the discomfort of not being in control, because it's in that discomfort that their growth becomes possible. And even if they never change, you will have. You'll have learned that power isn't something another person gives you. It's something you reclaim the moment you decide to stop playing small. So remember this, silence doesn't just shift the balance of power, it reveals who was willing to hold it with you all along. Silence has a way of doing something words rarely can. It forces clarity. When you stop talking to an avoidant, you aren't just creating space, you're creating a mirror. And in that mirror, over time, their true feelings begin to show. At first, they might resist it. They may try to convince themselves that your absence doesn't affect them, that they prefer the freedom, that they never needed you in the first place. But denial has a shelf life. Eventually, the emptiness becomes harder to ignore than the fear they've been running from. What begins as silence from you turns into noise inside of them. The longer you withhold contact, the more they're forced to sit with their emotions without distraction. The absence of your presence removes the cushion they used to lean on, and that's when their suppressed feelings begin to rise to the surface. They may not come running back with confessions right away. Avoidants rarely operate with dramatic declarations. But you'll see it in their behavior, in the way they circle back into your orbit, in the small ways they try to signal that you still matter to them. And here's the thing, those behaviors, those little attempts to reconnect are not accidents. They're the byproduct of emotions they can no longer fully suppress. Your silence has magnified their feelings, amplified the part of them that still wants closeness, even if they've been terrified of admitting it. The irony is that the very thing they feared losing you is the very thing that finally exposes the depth of their attachment. Now, this doesn't mean every avoidant will suddenly transform into a secure, emotionally available partner. Some won't. Some will stay trapped in their patterns, fighting against the vulnerability that your absence stirs up. But even then, the silence does its job. It reveals the truth. It shows you whether they are capable of meeting you in love or whether their fear will always outweigh their desire. And that truth is liberating because it gives you something more valuable than comfort. It gives you clarity. Think of it this way: if they come forward after your silence, it's because their feelings were stronger than their defenses. If they don't, it's because their defenses were stronger than their feelings. Either way, you no longer have to live in the exhausting ambiguity of wondering. Silence has already given you the answer, and let's take this one step deeper. At its core, silence isn't about punishing them or manipulating them into confessing what they feel. It's about creating the conditions for reality to show itself. Words can lie, actions can be confusing, But silence leaves no room for performance. It strips away the noise and shows you the raw truth of where someone really stands. If they